I had a phenomenal conversation with my friend and Spanish language content creator, Carlos Eduardo Espina, on Substack Live recently. The conversation is awesome. It's in English, by the way, and we are going to check it out. You can get all my Substack Lives live as they happen at substack.davidpakman.com. Welcome, everybody. David Pakman here, very special Substack guest, sort of newer to Substack, Carlos Eduardo Espina. We had the pleasure of meeting a couple of times in Washington, D.C. You know, for people in my audience who aren't familiar with you already, I want to tell a little story. Not to embarrass you, but just I think so people understand kind of what you're
Let's
up to.
hear it.
Carlos is like he is an all-star to people in a number of different worlds, and a lot of his content is in Spanish. He cannot walk. I've only seen this in DC. Okay. Maybe it happens in other cities. He cannot walk down the street in Washington, DC without everybody just wants to say hello. Mostly Spanish speakers, I think, right? But
Yeah.
you are doing some English language content too.
Yeah.
How did you build this platform?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So now it's all over the country. The other day I went to the Gold Cup final, Mexico versus USA, and it looked like, Justin Bieber back in 2010.
I
It's
saw
like
that on your
all over.
Instagram.
But no, it's a real privilege for me. And I started during the pandemic, so at that point I had just graduated college. I went to Vassar College in New York. Wanted to do nonprofit work, but because of the pandemic, it was very complicated. I was graduating in May of 2020. So I was at home with my parents, taking care of them, trying to figure out what to do with my life. And I got the idea to start, doing citizenship classes on social media, on Facebook, because I used to do that, back in the day in high school and all through college. So I had a lot of experience teaching citizenship classes. And I was doing lives on Facebook, and someone's like, "Oh, you should do it on TikTok too." And I thought it was really silly at that point because to me, TikTok was like, dancing and singing and just kind of ridiculous. But I was like, who's going to want to watch me on TikTok? But I made my first video, was in Spanish, as you mentioned. I said, hey, if you want to become a US citizen, these are the steps. Let me know if you want to know more. And it just started blowing up overnight, got like 100,000 views, went from like 0 followers to like 3,000. And people were like, we want to know more. We want to know more. So I started making more content around citizenship. And then around that time was the election, 2020. So people started asking, hey, what do you think about Trump? What do you think about Biden? I was like, hey, well, I have a degree in political science. Might as well put it to use. This is what I think. And it just kind of blew up from there. And then for the past 5 years now, I've been making content every single day, mostly, like you said, in Spanish, for Latinos here in the United States, about what's going on, current event, news, my opinion, all that sort of stuff. And I have been trying to do a little bit more content in English, stuff like Substack and opening up my English TikTok page. But I'm still getting the hang of all of that. But yeah, no, it's just been a wild ride for these past 5 years.
What was there, like, a lot of times people ask me, what was the moment that I realized something? And I always go, there was no moment, because it's like
Yeah.
each day you get a few more followers and it kind of feels like you're doing the same thing. But you had some big things where you spoke at the DNC.
Yeah.
You had, you've had all of these really big individual things. How did you even get pulled into that, where you thought, oh, someone is noticing what I'm doing who is in a position of power?
Yeah, so like the first big moment for me was, keep in mind I started during the pandemic, so I almost like for the full like I was at like 1 million followers and I hadn't barely left my house. I mean, I was in College Station at that time. So like, people knew me but from my activism and work from before social media. So like I'd never really been recognized. And then, I remember when the vaccines came out and, my parents got the vaccine, I got the vaccine. So we felt a little bit more comfortable going. I went to Dallas, just to go hang out. And I went to this like flea market and, Latino flea market. And I'm just there and like, people are looking at me and I'm like, what are these people looking at me? Like maybe because I'm not from Dallas or whatever. And then people started to come up to me. They're like, oh, you're the guy on TikTok. You're the guy on TikTok. And like, keep in mind at that point, I was at like 1.2 million followers. And that's when it clicked in my head. I'm like, oh, like, that number that you see on a screen, those are real people who like listen to you, care about you. Now having 13 million followers, it's like tenfold what it was at that point. But that was like really the moment I realized like there was something special as far as like getting recognized politically, like and at a bigger level. The White House started doing like these briefings for content creators about like a lot of different topics. This was back in like 2021. But for the longest time, I was never invited to any of that. I think just because I spoke Spanish and people just didn't know I existed until it was another creator who's Latina, but she also does like, work in English and in Spanish, started mentioning me around like, these political content creator circles. Eventually I got to the White House and they're like, who the hell is this guy? And how do we not know he existed? And like, how can we get him here? So I got invited, in early 2024 to go to the White House. And I said I wanted to talk to like the immigration team, kind of express some frustrations that me and many people who followed me had. And the conversation went really well. From there, I got to meet Tom Perez, who at that point was like, the highest Latino, I guess, around Biden, the Biden administration. I became friends with him, and then it just became this whole thing where I started meeting more and more people at the White House, where it eventually got to the point where Biden was going to roll out this executive order on immigration, and they invited me to be there. They're like, we want, people who helped kind of shape this policy and who helped work on it and all this and that. And then like 2 days before, they're like, oh yeah, so Tom Perez was showing the president some of your videos, and the president wants to make a TikTok with you announcing the policy. And I was like, wow, that's not something I expected, but it's one of those opportunities you can't turn down. So I make the video, it goes super viral, gets like 20 something million views. And then at that point, media is like, wait, who is this guy? How did he get in the White House? How does he have so many followers? How did this all happen? The New York Times does like a profile on me. They run it and everything. And that leads to a lot of attention. So when, they're doing the lineup for the DNC, I guess, I get mentioned like, hey, this guy that did this at the White House, he's really cool, all this, and ended up there. And so it just, from there, my life has even snowballed even more. It goes like from being known within your community to a bigger, wider audience has just been something really very quick and very crazy all around, but I've enjoyed it.
I wanted to ask you whether you think, and this, if the answer is yes, this doesn't mean we're attacking anybody. This is just like a
Yeah.
cultural thing. Do you think you were taken less seriously because your initial content was all in Spanish, mostly for the Latino community?
Yeah, I mean, that's always been, it happens to this day even. I've seen it in all sorts of, not just in politics, but like in general, when it comes like, collaborations with brands and stuff. I meet English content creators who have, a fraction of the reach I have, but they're able to command, bigger pay when you're working with like whatever kind of brand it may be. You see it in all aspects. And I think a lot of times people, I guess, almost diminish the size of your audience or like the value of your audience because they speak a different language or they just don't understand the dynamics of it. But at the end of the day, it is what it is. I'm fully aware of that. I try not to like, make a big deal out of it, but it is a reality, like you mentioned. That's also one of the reasons I want to get more into like English content, because people have told me, like, hey, like if you had a tenth of the followers you had now, but they were in English, like unfortunately, like it's a sad reality, but it would like mean a lot more. And I don't take it in a bad way. I just understand like that the way, this country works. And like, the people who watch me are not generally people like in positions of power, meaning like members of Congress and, people in the press and stuff like that, because, just a dynamic, which for me is an honor. I get to speak to people who in many ways have felt ignored for so many years, which is why I think I've gotten so much popularity, because like, hey, there's this guy who's like not trying to cater, to like the usual audience. Like he's actually speaking to us, for us. And I think that's really helped me grow, but it is a reality that I have, accepted.
I want to talk a little bit about what we've seen over the last 6 months in terms of the deportation program,
Yeah.
detentions, people being snatched off the street, people being run over in San Francisco last week. I mean, there's so many things we can't possibly squeeze it all in, but I think to get your view on, we are trying to tell a lot of the stories of what's happening. I'll give you some examples. Trump said it would be so-called violent criminals, but they're going to Home Depot parking lots and farms and just getting workers. Okay, that's one story. Another story is the conditions of detainment. Another story is law and order being ignored, due process being ignored. There's all these different stories that are being pulled. Is there something that you think right now, even we on the left, are either not aware of or not amplifying enough about just like the horror of what is going on?
Yeah, so there's like It's all around. There's just so overwhelming. But I think one of the things that has been, the most impactful is immigration is one of those issues that once it hits you, it creates like a whole bunch of other like issues that just kind of snowball. Like a really real example that has happened recently. I've had a lot of like mothers who reach out to me and they're like, hey, my husband was the sole provider for the household. He got picked up by ICE. So now he's detained and we have no one to provide for the house. If I go out and work, well, no one can take care of the kids. So now you're like, it's economic issues, it's childcare issues, it's medical issues, people who the stress of everything that's going on is leading to, heart issues and blood pressure issues. And, like you see, yeah, there's the issue of the person who actually got detained. But every time someone gets detained, you have children who are suffering, you have wives who are suffering, you have entire households. And now many people are contemplating, well, what can I do? It's also impacted work. So like looking for work is not as easy as it used to because now people are spending less, especially in the Latino community. A lot of Latino businesses, they're getting less clients, so they're having to lay people off. It's like a snowball effect. Like the actual immigration enforcement is like the tip of the iceberg, but it just trickles down and affects almost every single aspect of life. And I think that like secondary and tertiary, suffering is not something that's really covered as much. And those are the cases that I'm dealing with every day, how can I help these people? Even we saw the raid yesterday in California. I have like kids reaching out to me like, hey, my dad's the one who was going to pay for my college next semester. And now I don't have a dad because he's detained. Like all these other issues just kind of, morph into one. And it is just so overwhelming. And how do you even address all of it? It's almost impossible.
I remember when you and I and a number of other creators were at a meeting at the White House with Tom Perez, one of the things that came up was what is going on in certain Latino communities
Hmm.
with more Latino voters thinking about maybe I like Trump, maybe I voted Trump. We're seeing a kind of shifting sand in the
Yeah.
political ecosystem. It used to be the case that it was like, yes, Cubans were more reactionary. Yes, some Venezuelans were more reactionary. But for the most part, this is a community that was on the political left to differing degrees, on average, more religious maybe than your average American leftist, but still religious in the way that people are Catholic in Central and South America, which is often a little more casual, a little more cultural. Okay. Something different does seem to be going on now, where I would get calls on my show or run into people who go, no, I'm Mexican American and I just like the way Trump's talking and I don't trust Biden or I don't trust Harris or even Argentinians, right? From Argentina, where I'm from, who go, no, 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 Harris, no, I'm voting for Trump. Or are you seeing that? Number one? Number two, what do you think is driving it?
Yeah, so there's definitely been a major shift, and these are alarms that I was sounding way before the election. This like, it's called the rightward shift, but I always like to say it this way, Latinos are very unique here in the United States that we don't have a set political identity. And I mean this in a good way. Like, for example, I grew up here in Texas. And I've met a lot, like white people who say, hey, I vote Republican because my parents vote Republican and my grandparents vote Republican. It's like almost being
Yep.
Republican is part of your identity. And I've seen the same with a lot of Black Americans who I'm friends with, I speak with, and they're like, my grandparents were part of the civil rights movement, and I have this like political formation as part of my identity. Whereas a lot of Latinos, especially people like you and me, we're either first or second generation, so I can't say, hey, my grandparents have a legacy of voting Democrat or Republican because my grandparents never even lived in the United States. So we are a new community in the sense that we're still forming our political identity. And that's why you're able to see these, almost insane swings from one way to another. And so when people talk about the rightward shift and all this, I don't think it's a permanent shift. I think it's with the times, but just as, 40 something percent voted Republican this time, that same 40 something percent can then swing back and vote Democrat the next election. And the way of doing that is really messaging on the fact that, yes, a lot of Latinos voted for Donald Trump for separate reasons. I, you know, I'm kind of a hardliner. I don't think there was any valid reason to vote for him, but I do understand that, not everyone sees the world the same way that I see him. But the biggest issues we need to tackle, one is Spanish messaging. I've said it a million times and I'll say it again. I genuinely believe that not if Kamala Harris would have spoken Spanish, she would have won the election. Even if she would have had a better Spanish, comms team, putting out messaging in Spanish, I think she would have won the election, because what we see in Spanish language messaging is just so much misinformation being put out by the
Yes.
right. And I think the Democratic apparatus has not gotten, you know, good enough at combating it. And when the candidate themselves or herself can't combat it directly because she can't speak the language, you need to have a very strong, apparatus behind that candidate to be able to counter these narratives. I mean, before the election, I had people saying, I'm voting for Trump because I saw that Kamala Harris hates God. And I'm like, well, where is this coming from? But these are real things that are influencing real people. And so I think the messaging part is really lacking in the Democratic Party establishment, whatever you want to call it. But then bigger than that, there's a point you hit on, which is religion. I think, and I've been a big advocate, I've gotten some pushback on this, but I do think there is a way for Democrats to message along the lines of religion in a much more humane way. Like today, I just made a video. The Archbishop of Miami came out and said, hey, what's going on in Alligator Alcatraz is completely inhumane, and politicians should be ashamed for supporting this. Why? Because true Catholics, we read the Bible and we say, hey, the values that are being here are being spoken here are not the values being embodied by the Republican Party. So how can we as Democrats, at least when it comes to Latinos, not shy away from religion but lean into religion and say, hey, there is a religious route to take within the party that means, yeah, taking care of the poor, taking care of immigrants, taking care of people who really need it, and really embrace, I guess, almost that progressive political messaging. And then there is also the reality that there's so much fragmentation among Latinos between communities. So,
Yeah.
you know, it sucks to say, but the majority of Mexicans I know, or Mexican Americans who voted for Donald Trump, they did so because they really bought into this idea that Venezuelan migrants are ruining the country and ruining everything. And they voted for, hey, I want to get the Venezuelans out. And people are like,
Right.
you're turning against your own people. But in their mind, it's like, no, it's not my people. Those are Venezuelans, which are not my people, which to me, like I said, I don't think is justified. I think it's outrageous to think that way. I think we're all Latinos and we're all persecuted the same way. And I think many people are coming around to seeing that. We saw it a lot with Cubans too. They'd been protected from immigration enforcement for so many years that they thought they were immune from this. Now you have mothers on Telemundo and Univision. They're crying, oh, my kid got detained by ICE. My husband got detained by ICE. I mean, the mental gymnastics people did to justify their vote for Trump is honestly, for me, unjustifiable. But now that they're coming around, how can we capture those people and bring them back into, I guess, our side, if you want to call it that?
Last time I was in Vegas, I had an Uber driver. I get in, and I don't know if he was listening to local talk radio or if it was like a podcast or something from a radio. So I'm not saying this was Vegas Spanish talk radio, but he was listening to Spanish political content. So we got to talking. Tell him I'm from Argentina. This guy was from Bolivia. We get to talking, and then he recognizes me. He realizes he's seen my content. And I use like a different name on my Uber account just like for safety. I don't want people to be like, oh wait, I know exactly. So I use a different name. And he goes, wait a second, isn't your name David Pakman? And I go, yes, it is. And he goes, yeah. And he's like, oh, and I'm like, yeah. Sometimes I might get into an Uber with a guy who doesn't like my point of view. And he goes, well, actually, I don't like your point of view. And I go, oh, really? Like, what don't you like about it? And he goes, I'm just not down with the communism. I just know too much about Latin American communism. And I go, perfect. I'm not a communist either.
Mm.
Tell me what you think is communist about at the time it was Biden who was still the nominee.
Yeah.
And of course, there was nothing about Biden that was communistic, but it was very interesting because I'm hearing what he's listening to, which is the disinformation that you're talking about that's on Spanish language programming. And the reason he doesn't support Biden is because of communism. It was like a front and center, like, wow, this is a specific vote for Trump in Nevada because of something he heard on these disinformation platforms.
Yeah. No, I mean, the disinformation, when you really have those conversations, it starts to break down the narrative because, like you said, a lot of it is based in just false narratives. But yes, Republicans have gotten very effective at Spanish messaging, infiltrating the Spanish media ecosystem. I think the real turning point was during the pandemic. A lot of misinformation and conspiracy theories around the vaccine, that if you take the vaccine, that's the devil's mark and all this stuff. And, I always bring this point up to people. You think misinformation is bad in English? In Spanish, it's 100 times worse. And the reason why is because a lot of these platforms, they have content they have teams that moderate the content and all this stuff. But the algorithms are designed in English. They're not there to
Yep.
pick up misinformation in Spanish. So in Spanish,
Yep.
I can go and say the wildest thing, and unless it's something like very, very extreme, it's not going to get picked up by the algorithm. It's not going to get flagged. It's not going to get taken down. And so
Right.
a lot of people have found that, and the reality is, sensationalism and conspiracy theories, they do well on social media. So if I'm making videos saying Kamala Harris hates God and it gets 5 million views, I have no reason to stop making that kind of content. Obviously, you would hope people have morals, but a lot of people unfortunately don't. So you've had a lot of these, figures in the Latino right. They pop up and they just spew these crazy theories and people buy into them. And I'm not saying we need to spew crazy theories of our own, but we need to be equally as effective in doing the Spanish language messaging, because I think there's a big misconception that Spanish speakers don't vote because they're immigrants with this and that. There's so many people like my parents that they've been citizens for decades now, but they like to consume stuff in Spanish. Why? Because they feel more comfortable. And it's not that they don't know English. They're bilingual. My dad's a university professor. He's been teaching at A&M for 40 years. He knows English perfect, but he just likes, reading things in Spanish in his language, and that's normal. So how can we, bake our narratives into that, and then at the same time be understanding of the Latino community, because there are, some narratives that have been very frustrating to see. For example, one that always frustrates me is, oh, Latinos voted for Trump because they hate women. And I'm not going to say there's no problems of sexism in the Latino community, but it's hard to say that when you have Mexico, which is a very socially conservative country, with a woman president that has 80 something percent approval rating. So if the idea is that all Latinos hate women and they're never going to vote for women, how many women presidents have there been in Latin America? There's been way more women presidents in Latin America than in the United States. So while that is an issue, I'm not saying, hey, machismo and sexism is not an issue in the Latino community. I've seen a lot of these narratives that try to, oh, Latinos are a lost cause because they're racist, because they're homophobic, because they're, sexist. And yes, those are issues in our community. But those are issues that can be overcome with the right messaging and with the right work and the right, political framework, which I think has just been missing. Many Latinos feel like the Democratic Party has no identity right now. And that's what they went with Donald Trump. They say, I know what Donald Trump stands for, which is, not good stuff, but at least I know what he stands for. Whereas I don't know, the Democrats, one day they'll say one thing, they'll say another. I think we really need to focus our messaging and hit it home, and it'll resonate with the community.
For this next question, I just want to make sure I'm framing it correctly. Remind me, you were born in Uruguay or in the US?
So it's a complicated situation. I was born in Uruguay, but my dad was a citizen at the time that I was born. So I
A
was
citizen
born,
of the US.
yeah, I was born with like a consular birth certificate. Yeah, it's a very long story, but yeah, my dad came to the U.S. in the 80s, got his master's, got his PhD here, became a university professor, and then he became a U.S. citizen, and I was born abroad.
So you are considered a natural born citizen, is that correct?
Yeah, something like kind of like Ted Cruz, right?
Like Ted Cruz. Okay, yeah.
Yeah,
So the context of that is, I mean, with everything that's going on and this talk of denaturalization of
yeah,
people who commit certain crimes, but like we know with Trump, it's always like you put an initial line, but then you start kind of
yeah.
coming closer and closer and closer. Because of your activism, because of your large reach, you're involved directly in helping folks in all sorts of different situations around the country. Are you worried that you could become a target of this administration?
I mean, I'm not really worried in the sense like, obviously you think there's stuff you think about from time to time, but if you're asking me if I'm scared, I think not really. And the reason why I think being scared in this moment would be a disservice to my community. I think, the real fear is people who have been here for 10, 15, 20 years go to work or go to drop their kids off at school and they don't know if they're going to come back home at night. That to me is real fear. So for me to let myself and my hypothetical fear, kind of cloud my ability to do my work, I think right now more than ever we need people who are brave, people who are afraid to say things that they are. And obviously, you're always cautious about, where you're at. I'm always checking my surroundings. I'm not gonna, what I'm more afraid of is not so much the government. What I'm afraid of is, especially after the pardons in January 6th, is they've almost enabled and empowered, radicals to go and take matters into their own hands. So I'm
Yeah.
not worried, so much of Trump coming after me or whatever. I've always been more fearful of someone inspired by this language and by this rhetoric to think, hey, this guy is an enemy. Because look, when you talk about immigrants being an invasion to the country, the logical, conclusion of that is that anyone who is sympathetic to immigrants is therefore an enabler of an invasion. And if I support an invasion to this country, that makes me by default a sort of enemy, right? So
And
But I would
not
work.
only that, by the way, also that anyone who does something about the problem is
Yeah.
justified, even if it goes beyond
Exactly.
the
So
bounds
that
of the
so that's
law.
what I've always worried about, like I said about the legal whatever. But when we go, like, I've always just been fearful of, like, hey, all it takes is like one crazy radical to do something. I think maybe that's something like you mentioned with the Uber stuff. You change your name. Like, there's certain precautions that you take, but obviously I'm gonna keep doing the work that I do. One, because I think it's right. I think it's based in my values and my principles, in my religious beliefs that, I don't, if I see a brother or sister suffering, I can't just leave them, especially when I have the capability, whether it's monetarily or, my platform, whatever it may be, to lend a hand. But also that there's just a bigger duty that I genuinely love this country. My parents love this country. I always tell people, there's a reason my family is here. There's a reason my family's not in Russia or China or in Latin America, because they wanted to be here in the United States because we believe in the values of this country. And that's something that I'm willing to stand up for and, do what I can to preserve, because I want my future generations to grow up in the same country, which, despite having many faults, is, in my opinion, the greatest country on earth, is going down a dark path. But I mean, it's on our hands to save it.
Yeah, I will often get nasty emails where, when they're not overtly anti-Semitic, often it will be, "Hey, why don't you just go back to Argentina if you hate what's going on here so much?" And to me, it's sort of like the silliest thing you could say, because why wouldn't I advocate for the country where I live to be better? Why does it mean that if I've identified a problem, the solution is I abandon the country and go that doesn't make any sense. We're
Yeah.
doing what we do because we have ideas about how to improve circumstances. We're not saying I'm going to abandon it at the first sign of a problem.
Yeah. And that's exactly right. And that's when, going back to the messaging, I think that's really the message that resonates with a lot of people. We're doing what we're doing because we love this country. There's been this attempt by, Trumpism and MAGA to paint anyone who's not Trump or MAGA as someone who hates the United States. I mean, for example, the other day, he said that the senators who are proposing legislation to unmask ICE agents, they hate this country. And that rhetoric is just so wrong. No, I love this country. I love civil liberties. I love the Constitution. That's why I don't think there should be, these agencies all masked up wearing sneakers. And I compare that, that resonates with people who are also immigrants as well. I've heard so many, Cuban, Venezuelans, and Nicaraguans, particularly, where they'll message me and they'll be like, this is exactly what it looks like in Nicaragua and Venezuela and Cuba, where you have this masked up dude. You don't know who the hell he is. He's wearing a snapback. He's wearing sneakers. He comes up, picks you off the street. Next thing you know, no one knows where they're taking you. I mean, these are tactics that are being used in dictatorships. And because I love America so deeply, I don't think that should be happening here. That doesn't mean I hate this country. That doesn't mean I don't think laws shouldn't be respected. But, you know, people are starting to see that it's not about, a left or right issue. It's an authoritarian versus democracy issue.
Yes.
And the route Trump is taking is very scary, especially for those of us who, like my dad, he came from a dictatorship in Uruguay to seek a better life here in the United States. Why does he want, to see the United States become what many countries in Latin America once lived and many continue to live? It just doesn't make any sense.
Hey, Carlos, last thing I want to ask you before I let you go. What country has the best empanadas, and how old were you when you figured out that it's Argentina?
No, so I mean, always everyone's always really. It's really funny because, so one thing I've been very effective in, is like leaning into these different differences, among Latino countries. Obviously, I'm always going to say Uruguay because that's what I grew up eating, whatever it may be. But it's very interesting to see, like these regionalities. Like one thing I've learned to appreciate a lot is, I feel like through food, I've learned a lot about cultures. Like growing up here in Texas, almost all
Yep.
my friends were either from Mexico or Central America. And it wasn't until I was a bit older that I started meeting like Venezuelans and Cubans and Colombians. And one of the ways I've been able to connect with those communities is, learning about their culture, which many people think, oh, Latino culture, but Latino culture is so different among, throughout the continent. So I encourage people who are watching, to try, hey, there's a difference between empanadas from Uruguay, Argentina, Colombia, Venezuela, wherever it may be, and, really lean in and try to learn about the Latino community in that way. And then you'll start to grasp just how complex it really is and why doing work within the community is so difficult. But yeah, I mean, I love food all around, so I'll eat whatever. That's my take on it.
An incredibly diplomatic answer, for sure. Listen, it's so good to see you. Keep up the awesome work, and let's do this again. And hope to see you in person again soon.
No, yeah, we'll be in touch. Let me know anything else. And I don't know how Substack works, but telling the people subscribe to you, subscribe to me. I don't know where there must be a button or
Subscribe to
something.
everybody. If these are my subscribers here, please make sure to subscribe to Carlos, vice versa as well. Thanks so much. So good to see you.
Ahí estamos, amigo. Un placer. Take care, everyone.
Okay, chao, hablamos.